The chamber was silent, until the sound of thunderous applause shattered the stillness. Heads turned, eyes widened, and in that instant, every rule of decorum seemed to bend. It was Senator Brian Schatz, rising to his feet, hands clapping in deliberate rhythm, breaking through the heavy air of political tension. His applause wasn't polite. It wasn't routine. It was defiant, electric, and history-tinged. The cameras caught it, the nation felt it. Applause like this is rare in the Senate chamber. Rarer still when directed not at a senator, not at a president, but at a congresswoman whose words had just sliced through arrogance with surgical precision. Jasmine Crockett, unyielding and fearless, had spoken with the kind of clarity that doesn't ask for respect. It commands it, and Brian Schatz knew it. For a moment, it didn't feel like Washington. It felt like something bigger. The applause carried more weight than any speech, more honesty than any press release. It was the sound of one lawmaker saying to another, "You are not alone, your courage is not in vain, your fight is worth celebrating." And in a place where dignity is often drowned out by cynicism, that sound cut like a lightning strike. The chamber reacted in waves. First the shock, then the whispers, then the realization that this was no ordinary exchange. Some faces froze in disbelief. Others, secretly, smiled. Across the aisle, a few narrowed their eyes, unsettled by the break in ritual, the acknowledgement that dignity had just risen above their theatrics. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Social media lit up within seconds, with clips replayed and captions scribbled. When the truth is undeniable, even silence can't contain it. The applause wasn't just a gesture, it was a verdict. But applause is never born in isolation. It doesn't appear without friction, without resistance, without a spark to ignite it. The clapping of Brian Schatz's hands was the exclamation point. But what came before was the sentence, the battle, the storm that demanded such a response. And that is where the story truly begins. To understand why the chamber erupted, we must first revisit the storm that led to this applause. Long before the applause echoed through the chamber, the air in Washington had been thick with tension. The culture wars were raging on every front: education, identity, voting rights, even the very definition of truth itself. The debates weren't just about policy anymore. They had become brutal contests over who gets to define America's future. Each hearing, each floor session, carried the weight of a nation at a crossroads, with dignity and deception colliding in plain sight. And in this chaos, Jasmine Crockett had emerged as something rare, a voice of moral clarity. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she was often the most precise. Where others blurred lines with half-truths, she drew them sharply. Where arrogance tried to dominate, she anchored herself in justice. For many, her presence became more than political representation. It became proof that the ideals of service, sacrifice, and dignity had not been drowned out. But clarity does not come without consequence. Each time Crockett spoke with conviction, she drew fire from those who thrived on distortion. They dismissed her, interrupted her, tried to diminish her role with smirks and insinuations. Yet, the more they attempted to silence her, the more undeniable her voice became. It was as though every effort to push her down only made her stand taller. And so, the stage was set. The chamber had become a battlefield of ideas, with Crockett's calm insistence on truth standing against a tide of arrogance and cynicism. The nation watched these clashes not with detached interest, but with personal stakes. For immigrants who had fought for a place at the table, for families who still believed in fairness, for communities long dismissed by power, Crockett's words felt like their own unspoken defense. This is why Brian Schatz's applause mattered. It wasn't simply recognition of a colleague, it was a declaration of sides in a struggle that reached far beyond one moment. By standing, by clapping, Schatz wasn't just honoring Crockett. He was signaling to millions watching that justice still had allies, that dignity still had defenders. In a chamber where ritual so often replaces courage, this break from silence felt revolutionary. The audience at home could feel it. This wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans, or left versus right. This was about something deeper, something older, the battle over the very soul of America. Was this nation still capable of honoring dignity over dismissal? Could truth still pierce through the fog of arrogance? In that applause, many found their answer. And yet, applause is only the surface of the story. For every clap that echoed, there had been jeers, sneers, and relentless attacks leading up to it. Crockett's composure was forged in those fires, her words sharpened by the very contempt designed to silence her, which is why the moment landed so heavily. It was not spontaneous, not random, but the result of battles fought quietly, often thanklessly, in hearings and hallways. The applause was the headline, but the story behind it, the conflict, the insults, the struggle for dignity, that was where the true drama lived. Because applause does not arrive in a vacuum, It arrives after a battle. Every hero's rise is defined not just by their strength, but by the opposition that seeks to undermine it. Jasmine Crockett's journey in Congress has been no exception. From the moment she stepped into committee hearings, she became a magnet for the very forces that thrive on arrogance, dismissiveness, and thinly veiled bigotry. These were not accidental confrontations. They were deliberate attempts to reduce her voice, to belittle her authority, to frame her as less than the role she had been elected to fill. It began with the interruptions. In hearing after hearing, Crockett's words were cut short by colleagues who masked their disrespect as procedural concerns. They talked over her, smirked as she laid out facts, or dismissed her questions as though her perspective carried no weight. These were not mere parliamentary tactics. They were acts of dismissal, calculated to send a message: you do not belong here, and we will remind you of it every chance we get. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Many of the same lawmakers who wrapped themselves in the rhetoric of respect for women in politics, or support for diversity, were the first to condescend to her. They would thump their chests about defending American values while ridiculing the very voice that embodied those values most authentically. They insisted they cared about justice, yet recoiled when Crockett exposed the rot beneath their sound bites. In their arrogance, they believed that repeating old talking points would protect them from scrutiny. What they didn't realize was that their behavior revealed more about themselves than about her. Each sneer, each dismissive laugh, each cutting interruption, they all stacked up like bricks in a wall of hypocrisy. But arrogance has a fatal flaw: it assumes permanence. It assumes that those who wield it will always be unchallenged. What Crockett's adversaries failed to see was that their attempts to silence her only amplified her presence. The more they tried to bury her voice, the clearer it rang to those watching at home. Consider the optics: one side red-faced, leaning into microphones with condescension dripping from their tone, trying to distort or distract. On the other side, Crockett, steady, unflinching, grounded in her arguments. The contrast was cinematic in its own right. It didn't take a director's camera to see who carried dignity and who clung desperately to arrogance. The villain forces wrote their own downfall simply by revealing how threatened they were by a woman who refused to be diminished. And the tactics were not limited to interruptions. They stretched into coded language, dog whistles disguised as concerns. At times, critiques of her tone or her decorum revealed a deeper discomfort, not with her words, but with her identity, her background, her refusal to conform to the narrow mold of what power had historically looked like in those rooms. For some, Crockett's very existence in that chamber was the challenge, her every sentence a reminder that the future did not belong solely to the old guard. But Crockett understood something her detractors did not: arrogance burns fast, but dignity endures. She knew that every attempt to belittle her was not a sign of her weakness, but of their fear. And fear, once exposed, loses its grip. The more they tried to box her in, the more clearly she showed she could not be contained. The more they mocked, the more people saw the contrast for what it was. In those tense committee rooms, in those dismissive exchanges, Crockett wasn't losing ground. She was defining the battlefield. And in doing so, she made it impossible for anyone paying attention to confuse arrogance with authority, or dismissal with strength. This is why the applause later mattered so much. By the time Brian Schatz rose to his feet, the nation had already watched the clash play out countless times. They had seen Crockett face down smirks, endure sneers, cut through hypocrisy with facts, and hold her composure where others would have cracked. His applause was not born out of a single moment. It was built on the foundation of every battle she had fought in the shadows of committee hearings, every indignity she had absorbed with dignity, every clash where arrogance had revealed its weakness. Her antagonists thought they were breaking her down. In reality, they were sharpening her edge. Their arrogance created the very conditions for her triumph, their dismissiveness setting the stage for her undeniable clarity. And yet, as the storm built, one voice refused to break. Every hero carries a story etched in struggle, and Jasmine Crockett's begins far from the grandeur of marble halls and polished chambers. Hers is not the tale of privilege, but of perseverance. A journey built on service, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that justice belongs to everyone, not just the powerful. Before she was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, she was a daughter, a student, and a lawyer who chose the harder road when easier paths lay before her. Her legal career was never about chasing prestige. While others sought corporate firms with corner offices and seven-figure salaries, Crockett walked into courtrooms on behalf of those who had no one else willing to stand beside them. She defended the voiceless, the tenants bullied by landlords, the working families crushed under unfair systems, the overlooked citizens whose pleas rarely reached the headlines. These weren't glamorous cases, they were gritty, thankless battles that demanded more energy than they ever returned in applause. Yet, for Crockett, each case mattered because each person mattered. This grounding in service shaped everything about her. She understood that the law was not just an abstract system, but a living force that could either protect or destroy depending on who wielded it. For her, the choice was always clear: the law should shield, not shatter; uplift, not oppress. And in the communities she served, word spread, not about a lawyer who won every case, but about one who fought every case as though it were her own family on the line. But that road came with sacrifices. Long nights with case files stacked higher than paychecks. Days when the stress of injustice threatened to break her spirit. Times when even allies doubted her insistence on fighting battles that seemed unwinnable. Yet Crockett pressed on, not because it was easy, but because quitting would mean abandoning those who had already been abandoned too many times. It was this unrelenting grit that carried her into public service. When she ran for office, she wasn't propelled by dynasties or deep-pocketed donors. She was propelled by communities who recognized in her a reflection of themselves. Someone who knew their struggles, who had stood in their corner before, and who would not forget them once she crossed into the halls of power. And power, for her, was never the goal. It was the tool. Crockett's mission was to amplify voices drowned out by indifference. On the campaign trail, she didn't promise perfection, she promised a fight. And people believed her, because they had already seen her fight when no cameras were rolling. This is why her presence in Congress struck a chord. She was not a politician who had learned to mimic empathy. She was a servant, leader whose empathy had already been tested in courtrooms and community centers. When she spoke about justice, it wasn't theory, it was lived truth. When she defended dignity, it wasn't rhetoric, it was muscle memory. In the chamber, this background gave her a strength that arrogance could not comprehend. Those who tried to belittle her did not realize they were testing someone forged in battles far more personal and punishing. She had stood before judges who doubted her, faced clients whose hope had already been extinguished, fought against systems designed to exhaust her. So when condescension and mockery surfaced in hearings, Crockett met them not with fragility, but with the resilience of someone who had already seen worse and refused to bow. And that resilience sparked loyalty, not just from constituents, but from ordinary Americans watching from afar. Immigrant families who heard in her words the echoes of their own sacrifices. Young women who saw in her composure a roadmap for navigating a world eager to silence them. Communities long overlooked who recognized in her defiance the courage they wish someone would show on their behalf. Crockett's story is not merely political. It is personal, universal, archetypal. She is the lawyer who chose service over comfort, the woman who chose to rise when others tried to push her down, the representative who chose to speak even when the chamber wanted silence. She embodies not perfection, but persistence. And persistence, in the end, is the mark of every true hero. It was this history, this bedrock of sacrifice and service, that made her confrontation in Congress so electrifying. She was not a newcomer finding her footing, she was a seasoned fighter whose footing had already been carved on the front lines of justice. So when the spotlight turned harsh, when insults tried to pierce her dignity, Crockett did not waver. She drew from the very battles that had brought her there, and in that moment, her composure became more than personal. It became a symbol. So when the insults came, Crockett did not flinch. And what happened next shook the chamber. The chamber was already tense when the confrontation began. The air seemed heavier, charged with the static of unspoken rivalries. On one side sat those who had grown comfortable in their arrogance, wielding interruptions as weapons, mistaking condescension for authority. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, steady, composed, her hands folded as if to signal she would not be rattled. The clash was inevitable, and everyone in the room knew it. It started with a dismissal, subtle, but cutting. A senior member leaned into the microphone, brushing off Crockett's remarks as though they were trivial, as though the facts she had laid out were nothing more than noise. Laughter rippled from a few seats, the kind of laughter meant to humiliate rather than amuse. Another voice chimed in, interrupting mid-sentence, insisting on procedure, as if decorum were a shield against truth. But Crockett did not take the bait. Instead, her voice grew sharper, not louder, slicing through the interruptions with calm precision. She did not match arrogance with arrogance, she matched it with clarity. Where they sought to obscure, she illuminated. Where they tried to drown her out, she refused to raise her tone, because she understood that composure, in the face of chaos, carries its own power. The escalation continued. Questions lobbed at her dripped with insinuation, designed to paint her as unfit, unprepared, undeserving. Yet each attack only seemed to refine her presence, like heat sharpening steel. Her rebuttals grew tighter, more focused, every word deliberate. She paused in the right places, letting silence do its own work. And in those pauses, the chamber felt the weight of her restraint. The contrast was undeniable. Her critics looked restless, voices quivering with forced bravado, leaning too far into microphones as if sheer volume could substitute for substance. Crockett, by comparison, appeared rooted, immovable. Every dismissal thrown her way rebounded into proof of her composure. Every attempt to diminish her ended up magnifying her. The audience watching could sense the shift. The more they tried to undermine her, the stronger she appeared. Even those in the chamber, who opposed her politically, couldn't ignore the optics. The scene played like a drama, where the antagonist reveals his own weakness through overreach. The louder they grew, the more petty their interruptions became, the more Crockett's dignity radiated. It was a textbook display of arrogance collapsing under its own weight. And then came the moment that brought the room to a simmering silence. Crockett leaned into her microphone, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering, and delivered a line so cutting, so precise, that the chamber's energy flipped in an instant. It was not shouted, not embellished, but spoken with the calm authority of someone who knew truth did not need theatrics. The words landed with force, not because they were dramatic, but because they were undeniable. Across the chamber, those who had been laughing just moments earlier froze. The smirks faded, the interruptions ceased. For a heartbeat, even her harshest critics seemed stunned into silence. The tension that had been building all along finally reached its breaking point. Viewers watching from home leaned forward, sensing that something pivotal was about to unfold. The chamber was no longer just a room of politicians trading barbs. It had become a stage where the stakes were clear: dignity versus arrogance, composure versus chaos, justice versus dismissal. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett stood at the center, holding the room without raising her voice, without surrendering her ground. And then, with the room hanging on every word, the turning point arrived. The turning point came not with shouting, not with theatrics, but with an unshakable calm that seemed to cut through the chamber like glass. Jasmine Crockett, her gaze steady, leaned forward into the microphone. She had endured the smirks, the interruptions, the dismissals. She had taken in every ounce of arrogance hurled in her direction. And now, with the room restless and the nation watching, she delivered her defense, not as an outburst, but as a masterclass in composure and precision. Her voice was even, deliberate, sharpened by conviction. Each sentence carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. She laid out her reasoning with the precision of a lawyer who had spent her life turning chaos into clarity. She called out the distortions, dismantled the insinuations, and did it without ever raising her tone. Her calmness itself became the blade, slicing through layers of arrogance that had cloaked the chamber. The room began to shift. Members who had been leaning back in their chairs now sat forward. The sneers softened into silence. Even those who had laughed moments before now looked unsettled, as if realizing they had misjudged the balance of power in that room. Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing the hollowness of the attacks against her. And then it came, the mic drop moment. A line so clear, so irrefutable, that it left the chamber stunned. She didn't need to shout it. She didn't need to embellish it. She delivered it with the confidence of someone who had carried heavier burdens than cheap insults. Someone who understood that truth carries its own thunder. The words landed like a gavel striking wood, final, indisputable, resonant. For a heartbeat, silence filled the chamber. A silence so thick it felt like time had stopped. Every eye turned toward Crockett. Every ear replayed the words that had just been spoken. In that silence, the weight of what she had accomplished settled in. She had not only defended herself, she had reframed the entire exchange. Arrogance had been unmasked. Dignity had triumphed. And then, breaking the stillness, came the sound that no one expected. Brian Schatz rose from his seat. His hands came together, once, twice, then again, the claps echoing across the chamber with a force that reverberated far beyond marble walls. Applause. Not a murmur of support, not a subtle nod of agreement. Applause. Cameras pivoted. Senators froze. The chamber gasped. Applause in this setting is rare, almost unheard of. To break the stoic rituals of the Senate floor with clapping was to shatter decades of convention. And yet, Schatz stood, unapologetic, clapping with the conviction of someone who knew he was witnessing a moment that demanded more than silence. It wasn't just applause. It was validation. It was solidarity. It was a signal that Crockett's voice had not merely been heard, but had been honored. In slow motion, the scene unfolded: Schatz's hands clapping, Crockett steady at her desk, the chamber caught between disbelief and awe. Gasps rippled. A hush fell, and then whispers followed. Some faces stiffened, clearly unsettled by the breach of decorum. Others quietly smiled. The villain figure, the very person who had tried to belittle her, shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado collapsing under the weight of the moment. Their smirk evaporated, their posture shrank. They had entered the exchange certain of victory, certain that arrogance would dominate. Now they were left diminished, rattled, exposed. And still, the applause continued. One senator standing against silence, creating a rhythm that resonated like a drumbeat for justice. It was not just about Jasmine Crockett in that moment. It was about everything she represented. Every interruption she had endured, every dismissal she had weathered, every coded slight she had absorbed. All of it culminated in those claps. The audience watching at home felt it instantly. Social media lit up in real time, captions flying across timelines. Goosebumps. This is history. Finally, someone said it. And someone else stood up to recognize it. Hashtags ignited, clips replayed within seconds, the moment already being etched into the collective memory of those who saw it. People didn't just watch, they felt part of it. For immigrants, it felt like recognition. For women, it felt like vindication. For progressives, it felt like a crack in the stone walls of cynicism. And for anyone who had ever been silenced in a room full of arrogance, it felt like justice. The applause was not polite, it was transformative. Inside the chamber, the energy shifted entirely. Crockett, still seated, allowed the moment to stand on its own. She didn't need to rise. She didn't need to gesture. The applause was enough. It carried the truth she had spoken into every corner of that space, echoing longer than any retort her detractors could muster. In their silence, in their discomfort, the villains revealed their defeat. It was cinematic, almost surreal. The stillness after her words, the eruption of applause, the rattled faces of those who had thought they controlled the narrative. And the calm presence of Crockett, a woman who had endured, who had stood, who had spoken, and who now had the chamber itself bearing witness to her triumph. This was the emotional peak, the mic drop celebration that would replay endlessly, not because it was orchestrated, but because it was real. Because truth, when delivered with clarity, doesn't just end a debate. It rewrites it. But the moment didn't end in the chamber. Its shockwaves spread across America. The sound of applause may have faded inside the chamber, but outside its walls, the echo became a roar. Within minutes, the clip of Brian Schatz rising to clap for Jasmine Crockett was everywhere. Circulating across timelines, stitched into TikToks, replayed on endless loops across Instagram and Twitter. Hashtags erupted for Stand with Crockett, for Truth Has Power, fair applause in the chamber. What had been a moment of defiance in Washington quickly transformed into a cultural tidal wave. Social media did what it does best. It magnified the drama, distilled it into something visceral, and sent it rocketing across the country. A single freeze, frame, Schatz's palms mid-clap, Crockett's calm face unshaken, the villain figure visibly rattled, was shared thousands of times with captions like, "This is what courage looks like." Memes followed, some biting, others celebratory. One viral graphic read, "Arrogance tried to laugh, dignity made history." Commentators pounced on the moment. Progressive voices hailed it as a seismic shift, a crack in the stone facade of Senate ritual that let humanity shine through. One activist tweeted, "When applause breaks the rules, it's because truth broke the silence." Another wrote, "Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended every one of us who's been talked over, dismissed, or disrespected." Cable networks replayed the exchange with breathless commentary. On MSNBC, a host called it the most riveting 90 seconds in recent congressional history. On CNN, analysts marveled at how quickly the story had jumped from procedural sparring to a national drama about dignity and courage. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist, cutting together montages that juxtaposed the villain's arrogance with Crockett's unflinching composure, punctuated by the thunderclap of applause. Celebrities joined in. A-list actors and musicians posted the clip with emojis of clapping hands and fire. One beloved singer captioned it simply, "Icon." Civil rights leaders framed it in historical context, reminding audiences that respect for truth has always required breaking silence. Activists on the ground seized the moment to galvanize followers, urging them to see Crockett's fight as part of a broader movement for justice and equality. The villain side, meanwhile, faced the weight of humiliation. Clips of their smirks and interruptions were replayed with mocking captions. Commentators skewered their arrogance, contrasting it with the applause that silenced them. The very behavior they thought would diminish Crockett instead became the reason she shone brighter. Memes branded them as relics of an era where bullying went unchecked. Their downfall wasn't just political, it was cultural, immortalized in viral content that stripped away their power. The hero side, by contrast, soared. Crockett's words were replayed in classrooms, quoted in op-eds, celebrated in community forums. For many, especially women and people of color, the moment resonated on a deeply personal level. It wasn't just about politics, it was about visibility, validation, and victory in spaces that often deny all three. The ripple effect spread beyond social media. Fundraising emails cited the moment as proof that courage still matters. Grassroots organizations held watch parties, replaying the clip like a highlight reel from a championship game. Even in living rooms and coffee shops, ordinary people were talking about it. Not in the language of legislation, but in the language of pride and vindication. The shockwaves weren't just digital, they were emotional, cultural, spiritual. It felt as if the nation had been waiting for something like this, a break from cynicism, a moment where truth wasn't only spoken but honored. Applause in the Senate chamber was rare, but applause in the streets, in the feeds, in the hearts of everyday Americans, that was unstoppable. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Because beyond the hashtags, beyond the viral clips, beyond the applause itself, something deeper was stirring. Yet beyond the memes and applause lies a deeper lesson. The applause that thundered through the chamber was never just about politics. It was about something older, deeper, more enduring. In that moment, the standing ovation became a declaration: dignity, justice, and truth still matter, even when cynicism tries to bury them. The sound of hands clapping was the sound of a principle too stubborn to die, the sound of America remembering what it can be when courage refuses to bend. Jasmine Crockett embodied that courage. She had endured the interruptions, the sneers, the calculated attempts to belittle her. Yet she never broke. Her strength was not in volume or fury, but in resilience. In the choice to meet contempt with clarity, to stand unshaken in a room designed to shake her. She became a mirror for everyone who has ever been dismissed, and in her reflection, millions saw themselves rise. Brian Schatz, in turn, embodied something just as essential: solidarity. By breaking protocol with his applause, he sent a signal that dignity is never defended alone. His hands clapping were more than a personal gesture. They were an invitation to others, a reminder that silence can be complicity, but support can change the story. In choosing to honor Crockett's stand, Schatz showed that even in halls built on division, unity is still possible. The universal truth of that moment is simple, but profound: dignity always outlasts arrogance. Arrogance can sneer, it can laugh, it can interrupt, but it cannot endure. It crumbles under the weight of its own emptiness, while dignity, quiet and steadfast, remains. What Crockett proved, and what Schatz affirmed, is that resilience and respect are not fragile. They are stronger than the mockery that seeks to break them. For the audience, the takeaway is clear. This was not just a viral clip or a trending hashtag. It was a reminder that truth requires defenders, and dignity requires witnesses. Each time someone refuses to bow to arrogance, they carve out space for justice to breathe. Each time someone chooses to applaud courage, they ensure that resilience is not left standing alone. This is why the moment lingers, because it was never about Crockett alone. It was about every teacher who has spoken truth to power, every worker who has demanded fairness, every parent who has taught their child to hold their head high in the face of disrespect. It was about the idea that no matter how fierce the storm, integrity can weather it. And so, the applause still echoes, not just in the chamber where it began, but in the lives of those who carry the lesson forward. It calls on each of us to be more like Crockett when tested, and more like Schatz when we see courage in need of recognition. It asks us to believe that dignity is not weakness but power, and that justice is not a dream but a choice made again and again. And that brings us back to why this moment must not be forgotten. The image remains unforgettable: Brian Schatz rising to his feet, the chamber erupting in applause, and Jasmine Crockett standing tall, unyielding, unbroken, and unafraid. It was more than a moment of politics. It was a reminder that justice will always shine brighter than arrogance, and that truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced. What we witnessed was history wrapped in humanity. It was proof that dignity, when tested, does not falter, it endures. It was proof that courage, when displayed, inspires others to stand alongside it. And it was proof that when arrogance believes it holds the floor, justice can still claim the room. But this story doesn't end in the chamber. It lives on through each of us. That's where you come in. If you felt the power of this moment, if you believe that truth must always speak louder than power, then don't just watch. Be part of this movement. Subscribe now and join a community that refuses to bow to arrogance, a community that believes dignity always wins. Share this video with someone who needs to see courage today, because sometimes one clip, one reminder, one spark is enough to reignite hope. And finally, join the conversation. Drop a comment below and tell us, what does justice mean to you? Because this moment isn't just about Crockett or Schatz. It's about all of us, about the kind of country we want to build, and the values we refuse to surrender. The chamber roared that day. Now it's our turn to carry that roar forward. Will you?